Hi, good evening. I'm Yaakov Katz, a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and welcome to our latest and newest episode on the inside analysis of Israel's war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Tonight, I'm joined by two distinguished academics, writers, professors, president of JPPI, Yedidia Stern, and my friend Daniel Gordis, Dr. Daniel Gordis, the vice president of Shalem College and a Koret Distinguished Fellow, author of a number of books, of course, about Israel. There's a lot to talk about today, and as it's hard sometimes to think what to begin with everything going on at all times, more hostages being released, Secretary of State of the United States, Anthony Blinken visiting Jerusalem and Tel Aviv today. But I thought we'd start with the U.S.-Israel relationship, because that is something that I feel to an extent now is being tested in some way. The Americans, and Blinken has made no secret of this today in his visit to Israel, obviously, Israel has the right to act in self-defense, that they always say. Israel is the legitimate side in this conflict. Hamas needs to be eliminated, that they say as well. But they want us to do more to minimize civilian casualties. And they want us to be more pinpoint or surgical in the strikes that we carry out. So I thought I'd start with you, Yedidia. How are you looking at this tension that might be building up? And is it something that's going to lead Israel and the U.S. maybe into something of a crisis? Yedidia, you're muted. Sorry.
I was saying shalom to Danny and to you, Yaakov. Well, the U.S. aid to Israel since the outbreak of this war is very extensive. Direct security aid, delivery of weapons and ammunition, and indirect security aid, the delivery of the two aircraft carriers to the region. There's economic aid apparently coming. There is intention to give Israel about $14 billion. And obviously the diplomatic and political support, which buys us time to do what we need to do on the ground. And the unusual visit of President Biden here during the war, where many Israelis felt not only flattered, but they felt they are in love, deeply in love with the American president. However, it shows us all what we don't like to see as Israelis, that we, to some degree, depend on American support. Now, it is likely that over time, the differences of opinion between the two countries will surface, not only in the context of the way Israel is going to use force in Gaza, but also, and I think most importantly, with the question of what will happen in Gaza after the war will end. We know that President Biden specifically stated, he wrote it in the Washington Post, that he wants Gaza and the West Bank to reunite under single governance, ultimately under the Palestinian Authority. And obviously, he wants to push us towards a two-state solution. But we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the majority of the public in Israel do not agree with this position. So apparently, we're going to face some kind of dispute that may cloud the tension, the relationship between the two countries. Now, are we going to witness some kind of dictation by Americans to Israel? I don't think so. As we all understand, the US has its own interests in the relations with Israel, beside of the, I would say, natural feeling of President Biden as a Zionist president towards Israel. He also sees us as part of a global campaign between the US and European countries on one side, and China, Russia, Iran, and other countries on the other side. And Israel is an important part of this coalition, and actually we are the central active arena in this coalition. I think that Jews in the US can also play a role in this, hopefully will not too strong tension between the two countries. As you know, Henry Kissinger just died. He was the first Jew to serve as an American Secretary of State. And, the controversy as the role he played after the Yom Kippur War is still open. Did he push President Nixon to send arms to help Israel? Or perhaps the opposite, because he wanted to push Golda Meir into concessions. And eventually he pushed Israel to give up territories in Sinai. And as you mentioned, Yaakov, today there is another Jewish Secretary of State, the US, Antony Blinken, and his involvement in what's going on here is extremely great. He joins the discussion of the Security Cabinet, and he's part, apparently, or at least aware, of Israel's military plans. So we should only hope that his involvement, the administration's involvement, will be beneficial to Israel, not only in the war, but in the future relationship between the two countries. Time will tell.
So, Danny, I mean, you're obviously a close follower also of the rumblings in the United States. And as Yedidia said, and I've joked about this in the past, my kids have started to call Joe Biden Saba Joe, right? He's such an embrace of Israel and really warm. And you feel that he means it. It comes from the Kishkas. You can't argue with that. Now, obviously, there's opposing sometimes worldviews. But the Americans are making no secret of the fact they want to see a two-state solution. They want to see an empowered Palestinian Authority. They want to see the Palestinian Authority come into the Gaza Strip. And Netanyahu has made no secret of the fact that that's not going to happen. And I would probably even argue that Netanyahu already has his campaign ready for the election that might come after this war, similar to Paris Yichalik Yerushalayim, right? Paris will divide Jerusalem in the 1990s. This time it'll be Benny Gantz or anyone else is going to let the PA into Gaza. I'm the only one who will stop the PA from going into Gaza. How big, the Americans must know that this is also obviously this trigger issue for Israel and the coalition. You see that they're going to push that hard on Netanyahu, knowing what his constraints are?
Well, I agree with everything that Yedidia said, and I think it's hard for us all to know what's going on internally. I think we're a little bit different from 73, as I'm sure Yedidia would agree. Blinken and Kissinger have different dispositions. And to be sure, Nixon and Biden have very different dispositions. I think all three of us that are on this call, we all live more or less in the same neighborhood, give or take. And though we've probably all seen the same huge sign right off of Emek Rephaim Street, I think it's on Kremia or Lloyd George, I forget exactly where it is, a gigantic thing. I mean, it's huge. It's the size of a half of a building. Thanking Joe Biden. It's really kind of an extraordinary thing. I went to actually just get, my car tuned up for the year. I was at the Toyota place, and there's an American and Israeli flag in the showroom. I'd never seen that before in my life. So there's something going on here where Israelis feel very taken care of. And this is not Richard Nixon. Joe Biden is not Richard Nixon. And Blinken spoke very openly about his own family's Jewish past, their Holocaust roots and so forth. The kind of thing that Henry Kissinger, whatever one thinks about him, and it's obviously a very divisive subject, the kind of thing that Henry Kissinger would never have done. He, despite his accent, was very anxious to leave his Jewish roots behind in terms of his own personal history. He didn't deny his Jewishness, obviously, but he was anxious to start over. Blinken is doing the opposite. So I think it's very hard to say. Look, there's two presidential campaigns going on here, or two campaigns going on. One is for prime minister in Israel, and one is for president of the United States. Joe Biden has taken some very significant heat in the Democratic Party because of his support for Israel, and he may actually use that as a kind of he may back down as a way of kind of winning some domestic votes. It's very hard for me to see, given where Joe Biden was and given where Blinken is, and given how clearly the Americans understand what's going on here, that they're going to push us to a place where we can't defeat Hamas. I would be personally very surprised. Joe Biden has continued to repeat that Hamas needs to be destroyed. Blinken has done nothing to back away from that. Now, I think all of us would like to be able to destroy Hamas with many fewer Palestinian casualties. There's not a person certainly of the three of us, and probably most people on this call, who take any pleasure whatsoever in the high Palestinian casualties. The problem is that Israel faces really an existential threat here. Because if Israel cannot defeat Hamas, then at the end of the day, people cannot move back to the Otef Aza, the Gaza envelope, as it's called, thinking that they're going to be safe. The precedent for that in the north with Hezbollah is huge. Israel has to prove to its citizens fundamentally that it can keep its citizens safe. Without that, by the way, the whole premise of Zionism is upended. The whole purpose of Zionism was to say the Jews are going to be safe one place in the world. And if this is not that place, then I think Israel goes through an even greater earthquake, which is to say, I don't think America is going to push Israel to that point. My gut would be there's going to be certain play to the public, and there's going to be certain play to Israel. Just in the same way, by the way, that Yasser Arafat spoke about Israel's right to exist, or living side by side Israel in English and in Arabic. He never ever said that. Same thing is going to be true here. Biden and Blinken and others will say certain things for America and then international consumption. And what gets said in the security cabinet, I'm assuming, is pretty different. But I find it very hard to believe that the United States will try to handcuff Israel so that it actually cannot defeat Hamas, which at the end of the day actually means that Israel would have lost the war. Hard for me to see that.
But just one quick follow-up though, Danny. Biden's already in an election year.
Right.
The cycle has begun. How much longer can he practically stand with Israel and not risk losing some serious votes?
Well, he's not going to lose the nomination, right? I mean, the nomination is not even a question. He's going to get the nomination. That's not.
He's got the swing states that are important to him.
Correct. I mean, a cynic would say he can't lose the nomination and he can't win the election. That's what a cynic might say. And therefore, it's really a question of who the Republicans elect. Is it going to be Haley or Trump? Because whoever that is going to beat Biden. I think that's not a crazy claim to make. He's going to face some very serious pressure. And I think that at the end of the day, there may have to be a quiet understanding that he's going to say one thing very clearly to Bibi and Gantz and Gallant and so on and so forth, with the understanding that they're going to ignore him. He's not. I find it very hard to believe he would cut off military aid. I find it very hard to believe he wouldn't get the parts and the armaments that we need. But look, everybody here is jockeying for position. Bibi is too. And I think, by the way, Peres yechalek et Yerushalayim, Peres will divide Jerusalem. This is not Peres. Gallant is not Peres. Gantz is not Peres. Bennett is not Peres. Whoever ends up being a serious contender to give Bibi a run for his money, which, by the way, the main person in that crowd is Bibi. I mean, I think he's set up a world in which it's going to be a plebiscite basically on the question of whether or not the country was going in the right direction and whether or not the government's responsible for the atrocities that were allowed to happen on October 7th. So I think Bibi's in a considerable amount of trouble. And I personally think, by the way, if he doesn't resign, we're likely to see protests here that make what happened in Kaplan Street during the judicial reform issue seem like the gathering of a small minion. I think 1 million people will take to the streets, and I think it'll be very ugly potentially. So look, to go back to your question, Yaakov, I just think the Americans are going to try to do a dance, and Biden is going to try to hold on to swing states, and yet they're going to give Israel the private leeway that it needs to do this. What none of the three of us know is, how long does the military really need in order to do this? And how much does the military really need to do to South Gaza what it did to North Gaza? And if it has to do it in South Gaza, where are these civilians supposed to go? Egypt's not going to let them in. We're not going to let them in. Nobody else borders them. Where are hundreds of thousands or even 1 million Gazans supposed to flee to? That's got to be obviously very much on the minds of the security cabinet. And I don't know what the solution to that is. But again, I would be very surprised to see a actual collision between America and Israel, even in the election season.
Yeah, what you just said about where are they going to go reminded me. Just the other day, there was a press conference with the Saudi foreign minister who said we Palestinians don't want to leave their land, so that's why we're not helping them leave. I mean, seriously, come on.
We all know that's ridiculous, because people have to understand the Palestinians are not in. Most of the Palestinians who are in Gaza are refugees from someplace else to Gaza, so it's not their land any more than it's anybody else's land. That's the convenient excuse. Yedidia, you wrote on in Tuesday's Yediot Achronot, I thought, or Monday's Yediot Achronot, I'm sorry, a really powerful piece that spoke about the disagreement, to the dispute, the internal dispute that Israelis need to have about the continued pause, lull, ceasefire, whatever you want to call it, hafuga, as we like to call it here in Hebrew. But everyone else around the world looks at it as a ceasefire that keeps on getting extended on a daily basis. And the question of getting the hostages versus
the ultimate objective, which I think we all understand needs to be the elimination as much as is possible of Hamas as a terrorist group and not being able to continue to threaten Israel. I think that everyone sees, these daily or nightly releases of hostages with all the people around, with the armed guys, the armed Hamas guys, with the Kalashnikovs, with the vests, with the magazines, showing up out in the open, driving in on those pickup trucks, 5 on each side. They're not destroyed, right? They might be weakened. We might have eliminated some of the brigades in the north, but they're still alive and functioning in the south. And that should just be a reminder that the mission ahead is still big and needs to get done. But Israelis, we have fallen in love, I feel a bit in these evening broadcasts and seeing these people come home, and it's amazing, and it warms my heart, like I'm sure it does for all of us. But this is complicated, a balance here that needs to be created. So at what point would you be recommending to the government, and then maybe I'll ask you, Danny, the same question, we have to get back to the main mission?
At the beginning of the war, Israel declared that the goal of the war is just to defeat the Hamas so that it would cease to exist in the Gaza Strip. Later, it took a while. Later, Israel added another goal, the return of the hostages. Obviously, everybody agrees that we would like to realize both goals at the same time, both. That's the best. But my question, that's what I wrote in Yediot Achronot, as you mentioned, and it makes a big storm here, this piece. What will Israel do if it turns out that it is actually impossible to achieve both goals, and we must prioritize, choose one of them? And I think this is a likely scenario. Eventually, the time will come when Hamas will stop keeping the same kind of routine that we're experiencing the last few days, and they will not agree to return some of the hostages, for example, the soldiers, unless Israel will stop the war and leave the Gaza Strip. And in such a case, that's my question, will Israel decide that it is ready to give up eliminating Hamas in order to secure the hostages or not? Now, past experience shows us that Israelis are very, very sensitive to the release of hostages. And the example is obviously the Gilad Shalit deal, when we released more than 1,000 terrorists to get not only one person, but it is only one person. And the dire result in that deal was that the terrorists who were released in order to secure the safety of Gilad Shalit are the ones who planned and carried out, apparently, the attack on us in October 7th. Now, as you mentioned, Yaakov, in recent days, the Israeli media all over the place, constantly busy dealing with the hostages, which is understandable. I mean, we are brothers, all of us. Everybody knows somebody. If I try to go into the Hamas's head, Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind the whole thing. If I'll try to go into his head, and he's watching, by the way, he knows Hebrew very well. He spent some 20 years in Israeli prison. So if he is watching the Israeli broadcast, the opinion pieces in the paper, if he's watching the heartbreaking posters all over Israel, everywhere, if he's looking into the demonstrations, when thousands of people are chanting in Tel Aviv the one-word slogan, release them now, all of them now. Sinwar understands very well that the Israeli public is maybe unable to cope with the issue of the hostages. And my question, that's what I wrote about, what eventually the Israeli leaders will do. Right now, they tell us that they will return to battle after the current pause. But is that how they will act in practice, and to what degree? I'm afraid, and I'm opinioning here my voice, I'm afraid that the outside pressure, but more than that, the pressure from inside, not to leave a single captive in the enemy hands, will soften Israeli determination to do what needs to be done. And I see the preview already flickering live on national TV here.
Yeah.
But as Danny said, I think that this time the price may be much higher than the price in Gilad Shalit's deal. Because if this time too Israel will not defeat Hamas in such a way that Hamas will cease to exist in Gaza, then the country may lose the most important asset for its future, which is a deterrent, the power of deterrent against our enemies. I don't think that Hamas poses any existential threat on us, but the loss of deterrence is an existential threat. So now we are facing a battle between the logic and the emotion. And Israelis are taken away by the emotion, and I think this might be very dangerous. Now, I'm saying very explicitly, we should try everything to release the hostages, meaning risking soldiers, trying to put pressure, doing whatever it takes. However, we should not stop our war against Hamas. Mutual responsibility, arvut hadadit, as we say, is not only between us and the hostages. This arvut hadadit, this mutual responsibility, is also between us and our kids in the future. If the Israeli deterrence will be eroded, and the next time there will be a much bigger war, the price will be very high, as opposed to those who are hostages now that we know who they are. They have names and pictures. That's why we care so much. We don't know who are those who are going to be hurt by us not finishing the job. That's why I think that the test of leadership today in Israel is to prove Yihya Sinwar wrong and to go all the way, even, and it's obviously heartbreaking, even if it will cost some of the lives of the hostages.
Danny, your take on this tough issue?
It's agonizing. That's the first thing we have to understand. I mean, they have outfoxed us here since October 7th in more ways than we can possibly imagine. Last Saturday night, when the entire nation of Israel stopped everything, stopped breathing, basically, and saw the countdown, and you saw Nir Dvori on chapter 12 saying if they don't give him back he's the military correspondent and commentator for Channel 12, a very, very smart guy, in my opinion, saying, you could see him getting all worked up on live TV and saying if they don't give these hostages back, it was the second night. By midnight, then we should I hope he said the security cabinet is talking about right now what's going to happen at 12:01 if this delay extends into the next day, which it was obvious it wasn't going to. They were just playing with us. But they have been playing with us in a heartless, brutal, just disgusting way. I mean, if these Bibas children really have been killed, it is just beyond. So there are the hard breaks, and I could look out my window right here, and I can really pretty much almost see the house of parents who have a child in Gaza, and people that might well very much see on the street tonight, tomorrow, whatever. And it's just heartbreaking. But at the end of the day, I agree completely with Yedidia, with tremendous reticence and with tremendous heartbreak. If we can't guarantee Israelis that this government has learned its lesson and it's going to keep its citizens safe, then there's no deterrence with Hezbollah. There's no deterrence with the Houthis in Yemen. There's no deterrence with Iran. And as numerous people, including, by the way, Thomas Friedman, have pointed out, if there's some 400, he claimed 400,000. I don't know if that's the right number or not, but he claimed that there's some 400,000 people that really make Israel tick. They're the chief academics, or the chief scientists, or the chief economists, or the people behind the startup nation. They're the 400,000 people that Israel really needs to make this country what it is. And he raised the point that if they can't be fairly guaranteed that the government has the capacity to ensure that they can raise their children and grandchildren here with a modicum of security, how many of those 400,000 are really going to stay over the course of time? That really is what makes this an existential battle. It makes it an existential battle not because Hamas can put boots on the ground in Israel. It really can't do that. It did it for a while on October 7th, and October 8th, and some of them survived until the 9th and the 10th, but very few. Now, presumably, there are none left. But it can shake Israel to its very, very core without putting another single boot on the ground. And if Hezbollah, by the way, it's the same thing. If they can keep shelling the towns in the north, who's going to go back and live in Kiryat Shmona? Who's going to go back and live in Shlomi? We will have ceded territory without our enemies actually having a single tank, a single plane, except for a hang glider here and there, and putting any boots on the ground. And it's just unbelievably tragic and heartbreaking. And it just reminds us of the cataclysmic and utter failure of so many dimensions of the government leading up to October 7th. When we start doing the investigations and we find out that these young tatzpitaniyot, young women who are put in these places to look through the cameras and see the screens, were actually warning people that they had seen stuff that looked very, very, very different. When we're hearing that people in Shmona Matayim and 8200 were picking up calls that made them think something very serious was being planned, and they passed it upwards on the food chain, so to speak, and it was ignored, perhaps in some cases because of a gender issue. I hesitate to say, but I wouldn't be shocked. The cataclysmic failure is just impossible. But at the end of the day, we have to save the country. And you're right. I mean, Yedid is right. Arevut hadadit, a sense of common obligation, is to the 9 million people that live here, beyond, tragically, the 140-something families who have people trapped there. So it is a horrible, horrible decision with, by the way, very interesting roots in Jewish tradition. The Maharam of Rottenburg refused to be ransomed out. He was captured, and he said, "You're not going to ransom me, because if you ransom me, then they're going to take somebody else, and you're going to deplete the reserves of the entire community." And he died in captivity. Interestingly enough, by the way, somebody else actually ransomed his body out later on, which is interesting because even the idea of ransoming bodies, which we might think about as a very modern thing, goes way back. But there are two competing principles even in ancient Jewish halachic tradition, one of which is that Pidyon Shvuyim, the redemption of captives, is one of the greatest obligations that a Jewish community has. And at the same time, we have precedent for people saying, don't do it because you're going to destroy the whole community. And I can say, by the way, we know at least one family, and I think two, where one set of parents intimated and one set of parents said to us explicitly that when their son went into Gaza, he said to them, "I want you to make me one promise. I promise you I'm going to try to come back. I want you to promise me that if I am captured, you will make sure that Israel does not trade more than one person for me." Now, I mean, that's an unbelievable thing for a young man to say to his parents. And it's just heartbreaking that children and parents have these conversations in this country. But I think that the young man who said that, and I'm obviously not going to say who that is, understood that Israel is vulnerable because of its heart. And at the end of the day, if we believe that the future of the Jewish people depends on the existence of a sovereign, sustainable Jewish state, which I believe with every fiber of my being, then Israel needs to do what it needs to do to make sure that it can remain sovereign and stable and sustainable. And it cannot do that, as Aditya quite rightly said, without deterrence. We're going to have a brutal decision to make here.
I've looked at it as our strength and our weakness both at the same time.
Exactly.
Our strength, like you said, our heart is that we do so much, we sacrifice so much for the few, the hostages. But on the other hand, it's our weakness because our enemies know that we do that, so they keep on taking advantage of it. And we just keep on setting ourselves up for this. And that's why I wonder, Yedidia, after the Gilad Shalit release, there was the Shamgar Commission that was set up, that was headed by the former president of the Supreme Court, Mayor Shamgar, no longer alive, which came out with conclusions that were never really made public because they were deemed classified, but really went back to what Danny was talking about, the Maharam Rottenburg, of you don't pay more than the value or whatever that is. I think they came up in their conclusions with some scale of what in the realm of logic makes sense to exchange for a soldier, exchange for a body, exchange for someone who's alive. Obviously, 240 hostages is a whole other scale that even the Shamgar conclusions and recommendations would not have matched up to. because of the utter failure and the scope of what happened. However, maybe when this is all over, and eventually this will be all over, hopefully, the war will be over. We might not have yet back all the hostages. But at some point, the country does have to make a statement and say, no, enough, no more. We're not playing these games anymore. And someone's going to pay the price, right? It's easy for me to say that because it's not my son, daughter, wife, mother, father, brother in Gaza. But you can't run a country like this.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I went to the prime minister who was serving at the time. I'll not mention his name. And I told him, listen, we have this idea that Shamgar's committee put on the table, which is classified, as you said, but I know the details and I like it. Let's do the following, I told the prime minister. It was a private conversation. Why don't you put together a group of whoever is still alive, ex-prime ministers, ex-Ramatkal and chief of staffs, ex-defense ministers from all the right and left wings in Israel. All of them will sign some kind of agreement between themselves that they will defend the decision of any government, future government in Israel, if this government will try to implement Shamgar's conclusion against public opinion. And if it will be a wide consensus like this, it will give strength to the prime minister at the time. Well, he listened carefully to me and he did nothing, which is unfortunate. Now, we have to realize that when you talk about pikuach nefesh of the individual, life-saving of somebody, you sacrifice, or you might, chas v'chalila, sacrifice pikuach nefesh leumi, the national life-saving. And that's what we're discussing here. So we are very proud of our sensitivity, which reflects us. That's what we are. But we are not individuals. We have a nation here. We have to protect the nation. And that's why we need right now leadership. This is the ultimate test because I predict, Yaakov and Dani, I predict that we are going to face in the near future this dilemma in a very clear way. And the tone in the TV, when I was trying to put my article in paper, I saw that people are afraid to put it on print. Some of the papers were afraid to put this simple idea that Dani and myself were putting here very clearly. They were afraid even to voice this. And eventually, when they voiced it for the first time ever, a day later, they called me and asked me, what were their responses? So we are going to face a tough time, but I really hope that the majority in Israel will still be with understanding, with logic understanding that we have to survive. And it takes what it takes.
Danny, this is obviously a huge dilemma for Israel and for the Israeli people, but I think also for the global Jewish community. They look at what's happening in Israel, and Jews around the world are coming together in ways that we haven't really seen. Definitely not in recent years. I mean, what I know, first Intifada, second Intifada, it was never like this. Second Intifada, I was even explaining to one of my kids before, just yesterday, went for lunch with my 16-year-old. And we were sitting on Emek Rafaim Street. And she said, has there ever been a period that's so depressing like now? And I said, listen, we were sitting right across from where Cafe Hillel was, where it had blown up. And, I knew Dr. Applebaum, Nava Applebaum, two of the victims. And I said, yeah, there was this period of the suicide bombings that you could, right here, Cafe Hillel across the street. But then when I was thinking about it later, it was still so political at the time, right? Because you still had we just have to get out of the West Bank. It's the occupation, right? You had a very strong camp, but it wasn't that everyone was aligned. It seems that today, with what happened, that the left is no longer the left and the right is not. Everyone understands that it's politics aside for now. It's stay focused on the mission. How long does that keep itself going? How long does that stick together like that?
You mean between America and Israel, or American
Jews and Israel? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, I think that But there's a way in which Hamas's overwhelming success on October 7th is actually a detriment to their position now. Had they killed 40 people and not 1,400 people, the outrage would have been tremendous, and Israelis would have felt very vulnerable. But I think Israel would not have the kind of support internationally or among American Jews. By the way, they're having so many hostages. If they had five Gilad Shalits, and we knew the names of each of these soldiers, they might actually be in a better position than they are having however many dozen soldiers they have. Because let's be honest, and again, I want to be, I don't want to be crass, but I want to just try to be a fair assessor of what's happening in the Israeli psyche. We can all name the children and the women. Most of us cannot name the soldiers that they're holding, even though many of them are on the bases and on their posters. There's something about the women and the children that got to us in a way that's not fair, because men are just as, each one of them is a world unto himself. But the overwhelming numbers of what they killed on the 7th and that they're holding now may actually play against them in a way that would allow the kind of thing that Yedidja is heartbreakingly trying to argue for, may make it possible. Look, I think what's going on in American Judaism, look, between Israel and American Jews, we have 85 to 90% of the Jewish world. So while there are very important and really extraordinary Jewish communities around the world, when we speak about American Israel, we're talking about almost everybody, statistically. We're going through an earthquake here in Israel. We have failed in many of our obligations to our citizens. We did not keep our citizens safe. This notion of, the Havila Bajungel, we lived in this very nice fancy house around the jungle, but we could keep the jungle out of the villa. Not true. We're going to have to live as Sparta if we want to live here. And what that means for how we raise our children, educate our children, et cetera, we're going through a huge reassessment here of what Zionism is, of what Israel is, of what a successful Jewish state does and does not look like, and so forth. I think in America, what's happening is that a fundamental covenant there has been broken also. The vast majority of American Jews, except for the right, and that's a small slice of American Jewry, believe that if they paid a high enough price in terms of culture and overt Jewishness and so on and so forth, they could integrate. They would finally be accepted. They knew that there were problems with Black Lives Matter. They knew there were problems in some of the extreme versions of the woke community. They understood that the far left of the Democratic Party was problematic, and the far right, by the way, as well. But fundamentally, they said America is the place where we can make this deal. David Barak-Gorodetsky, who's at Haifa University, calls it the cult of integration. He says that American Jews have become a cult of integration, which I think is actually a fabulous turn of a phrase. They're finding out that deal did not work. We're finding out that containing Hamas was a failed idea, not a failed execution. It's a failed idea, fundamentally a failed idea. And they're finding out that this notion that you can whittle down overt notions of Jewishness or become universalist or whatever, and you're going to fundamentally be accepted, is a failed premise. And if American Jewish leaders are going to be honest about what they face an upending of everything that American Judaism has been based on for the last more than 100 years. In other words, the idea that the reason that American Jews were very hesitant, by the way, even to embrace the Balfour Declaration, and were certainly hesitant to embrace Herzl long before the Balfour Declaration, was because they felt if we don't do that, then we'll actually guarantee our status here in America. And what you're finding out is that you can be a college student in America and have to barricade yourself in the library. And you can be a graduate student on Harvard University's campus and get attacked. And you can be a Jewish student on almost any American university and hear from the river to the sea, which means Jews should be exiled and presumably slaughtered if they can't stay here and so forth. American Jews are going through a huge earthquake. What I have a feeling is going to happen is that there's going to be a split. We'll leave the right side of American Jews out because they've always been supportive of Israel and they are still supportive of Israel, and they're just saying told you so to everybody else. And by the way, quite rightly so. The way that the Israeli right is going to say about the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, told you so. I mean, and they're not going to be wrong. It's going to be very hard to poo-poo that. And I just recently rewatched this movie called Unsettled. It's a fabulous documentary made of the actual disengagement in 2005, where a very young movie maker who was actually himself a recent graduate of Harvard at that point went and actually filmed it and interviewed people. And you can see the people being carried out of their houses. And they say there's going to be rockets fired on Sderot, and there's going to be Mar Gemot, however you translate Mar Gemot, on this yeshuv and that yeshuv. I mean, and there's going to be people dying left and right. And they said they're going to come over the border, they're going to kidnap people. They actually said that. They look very prescient, and many of us look naive. We look terribly, terribly naive, the way that I think a lot of American Jewish leaders are now going to look very naive. They're going to have to actually ask themselves a very fundamental question about whether or not they're willing to rethink the fundamental ethos of American Jewish life. Many will not be willing to do that. And they are going to continue to believe that if they continue to pay a price, they will be accepted by the progressive left, and that price is going to be lining up with us. Especially as the pictures from Gaza get worse and worse, they're going to leave us. But I think a bigger percentage than would have been the case 2 months ago is going to stick with us, is going to say to themselves, actually, I've been reminded about the very important fundamental premise of Zionism, that the Jews need a place to call their own, because even here in the United States, hatred bubbles to the surface more rapidly than one might have ever possibly imagined or feared. So I think we are in better shape with a good portion of American Jewish life, and I think that's likely to stick for a while. I think we are in worse shape with a other portion of American Jewish life. But where Israel and American Jews end up a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, is going to depend on the following very difficult question. Can the leaders of liberal American Judaism say fundamentally, we were wrong? Not about Israel and Gaza, not about Israel and Hamas, but about Jews in America. We were fundamentally wrong. We thought that if we made Judaism into a religion and sacrificed ethnicity, if we made Judaism into tikkun olam and sacrificed peoplehood, if we made Judaism about social action in a way that wasn't all that different from the Methodists or the Presbyterians or the whoever's, that fundamentally we would be accepted. If they're willing to say that was wrong, for 100 years we built a community on a premise that was wrong, we might actually find, I think, a renewed basis for intense, profound engagement between Israel and American Jews, if Israel does the right things and embraces them as well, in ways that it has not been willing to do so far, much to our discredit, I think. But if the leadership of American Judaism is going to continue to try to sell to itself and to its adherents this notion that fundamentally we are accepted here, we just have to sacrifice peoplehood and ethnicity, then Israel's going to be ever more problematic for them than it was, and we're going to see a bigger split. I hope the former is going to happen, but I think it's too early to tell.
Lots of moving parts and lots still to be decided in this journey that we're on as a country, but also as a people. I want to thank you, Danny, for joining us. Thank you, Yedidia. To our listeners and our viewers over the last 8 weeks, I want to thank you all for being with us during this very complicated period as we've tried to ourselves navigate the issues that the war has brought to the forefront for Israeli society, for the Jewish people, anti-Semitism, and just some of the complicated issues that we spoke about today. We're going to be changing our format starting next week. We've been doing 5 days a week of this kind of shortened version of a webinar with interviews and panels. Starting next week, we're going to be going to twice a week, longer interviews, more in-depth panels. So we hope that you'll stay with us. We'll be broadcasting them Mondays and Thursdays. You can continue to find them through JPPI, on our website, Facebook, and of course, as a podcast. Again, Danny, again, Yedidia, thank you very much. And to everyone, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Bsorot Tovot.